Acadia Divinity College, the Graduate School of Theology at Acadia University.
Thank you, Caroline. Oops, excuse me. Isn't it great to have our new president on board and his wife, Gail? Please stand. We're enjoying having them very much already. The Simpson Lectures has been quite a remarkable series, as you've heard, since 1979. Those who have served us comprise a most impressive list, including such people as Dr. Gardner Taylor, known as the Dean of Black Preachers from Brooklyn, New York. Dr. Haddon Robinson, who came in 1987. Dr. Joel Niederhood, who was a quite remarkable Christian Reformed broadcaster. Dr. Alan Sell, the distinguished internationally recognized theologian who came in 1989. Dr. Eugene Peterson of The Message fame. And more recently, well-known present-day preachers, including Dr. Paul Scott Wilson of Toronto, who actually supervised Dr. Holmes' doctoral thesis, and Dr. Michael Quick, who was transplanted from England to try to enlighten the budding preachers of the USA some years ago. I think he's been quite moderately successful. Now, most appropriate to this week, however, are the connections with our present lecturer for this year, the Reverend Dr. Peter Holmes of Yorkminster Park Baptist Church, Toronto. I think Peter and I first met in 1983. I'd only been in Canada 3 years by then, and he was just beginning his studies at Wycliffe College in Toronto. In 1980, this is interesting, the connections with Peter are quite remarkable. In 1980, the Simpson lecturer was Dr. Leonard Griffith, a significant mentor of Peter Holmes. In 1984, the lecturer was Dr. John Gladstone, the renowned minister for 26 years of the same church as Peter now serves. And along the way, Peter was mentored by Dr. Gladstone. In his name, in Dr. Gladstone's name, the John Gladstone Chair in Preaching and Worship was established. And that's now occupied by Dr. Lionel Moria. And in 1997, the lecturer was yet another senior minister of Yorkminster Park, the Reverend Kerr Spears, with whom Peter served in an associate role as the Minister of Pastoral Care, and on whose retirement and return to Scotland, it slowly dawned on the church that their nationwide search for a successor was entirely unnecessary, since he was already on the pastoral team of the church in the person of Peter Holmes. He was inducted as minister of the congregation there in 2001. And I know that he and Kerr Spears enjoyed a very good relationship, which he has appreciated over the years. And Peter comes now combining the warmth and the wisdom of a pastor with a passion and with the imagination of a storyteller. He's served on all kinds of committees, of course, both denominational and ecumenical. And right now he's the chairperson of the Churches on the Hill, an organization which represents the churches of the Yonge Street and St. Clair neighborhood of Toronto. Peter is married to Janet, and Janet is here sitting right beside my wife. Well, you can't see my wife, so you won't know, but Janet is sitting here. We're delighted that she's with him. And one of their daughters was here and sang in the Wolford Baptist Church on Sunday morning where Peter was preaching. So we're delighted to have representation of the family. Peter, having begun his doctoral studies at another illustrious institution at McMaster, completed his DMin degree in 2006 here at Acadia. His thesis work is quite remarkable. You'll be surprised if I tell you that I read all the theses that are produced here. I've seldom enjoyed one. Enjoyed is not quite the word I like to use, but I'm using it anyway. A very well-written thesis on the whole question of the Christian funeral. And this work he carried out under the supervision of Dr. Paul Scott Wilson, who serves at Emmanuel College in Toronto. Now, prior to coming to Yorkminster Park, Peter Holmes served as the minister of First Baptist Church in Montreal, a historic urban church with a multi-ethnic congregation. Actually, he was born, I'll not tell you the year, but it was 50 years ago, coming up to 51, in Ottawa. And he was raised in Victoria, where his father, the Reverend Robert D. Holmes, served as a Fellowship Baptist minister for more than 20 years. Peter completed his undergraduate studies at the University of Victoria, and following that he worked, this is interesting, he worked as a carpenter's assistant, and then as the ombudsperson of the University of Victoria. So it's good to have a lecturer who is actually a handyman. Good to know, Peter. He comes to us this week, and this is a very significant evening for us at Acadia. He is the first graduate of Acadia's Doctor of Ministry program to be invited to be the Simpson Lecturer. And that shows not only how smart he is, but how smart the college is in inviting him. It's a very special pleasure for me, because I know his church very well, a very special pleasure to present to you our first, dare I say it, homegrown Acadia Doctor of Ministry, to bring the first of his 3 lectures on the theme of preaching life to death. This evening's theme is waking up the obituaries. Please join me in welcoming the Reverend Dr. Peter Holmes.
Andrew, thank you for those very kind words. I'm humbled at the task of being with you. I need to turn this mic on somehow. I think that's got it. If it doesn't, I'm sure they'll come running down. I'm humbled by the task that is before me, particularly when I hear some of those names, because they are people that I have looked up to in ministry and had the privilege of knowing and learning so much from. And as I look out, I'm also humbled. Thank you for coming on this stormy night. I wondered if we'd be gathered around a fireside in a living room somewhere when I looked at the weather. You're remarkable, and I'm grateful to you for your presence. I also look out and see some friends and want to acknowledge them. Barry Morrison, longtime friend. We served together in Montreal, and it's a delight to be in your parish, Barry, as such, and bless you. And then the great preacher from Toronto is here, and it's not me. It's my dear neighbor and friend, Andrew Sterling of Timothy Eaton United. What a privilege it is to have you. You know, it's time we got together for a coffee, Andrew, and imagine having to do that in Wolfville. But a dear, dear friend. And as I look up, I also see Dr. Brackney, who served us so well in McMaster. And who, in fact, set up the wonderful D-Min program they had there, and from which I benefited while it was there. But so grateful, too, Andrew, for the way in which you embraced me and brought me here. So, with all of that said, thank you very much, and it is indeed a privilege. Preaching life to death, and today waking up to the obituaries. I think it was Will Rogers who said, I don't wish ill on my friends, but I certainly enjoy reading their obituaries. I have someone in my congregation who tells me from time to time, and I think this joke's been around for a long time. Is my mic not on? Oh, that's better. Someone in my own congregation who tells me that he gets up in the morning and the first thing he does is to check the obituaries to see if his name's there. And if it's not, then he gets up and gets going. There's a sense in which I think, as leaders of the church, the obituaries provide a great deal of information about what's going on today at funerals, and a wake-up call for us. And an invitation to respond to what's going on. A couple of things I'd like to point out from the obituaries, changes in recent years. First of all, And I checked the Halifax paper, and it's very similar to the Toronto paper, in that when you open up the obituary page now, you always see anywhere from 5 to 10 pictures, faces, in the obituary page. This is quite new. It's in a sense people wanting to put a face and a name, more than just a name, but a face and a story on the person who's passed away. It's a cry for some kind of last authentication of the deceased. And it's not just, of course, the face, the picture, it's also the story. And the obituaries are becoming more and more fascinating. There's wonderful stories that are being told in the obituaries. And this is a new development. And it represents, as far as the funeral goes, something that we all face, and that is the desire among those who have deceased, among the family members, that the funeral take on a very personal touch, that we tell the story of the deceased. I have a book here that was written in the 19th century, or edited by someone by the name of E.J. Wheeler. I used it a great deal in my doctoral research. He went and collected some of the great preachers of that age, which was a great age of preaching. He collected their funeral sermons, and he put together a book of funeral sermons, and they're absolutely remarkable pieces of work. But one thing that you notice when you read these funeral sermons, from the likes of Beecher and Spurgeon and many of the great preachers of that era, is that there's no mention of the deceased, rarely even a name. Charles F. Deems, one of the preachers here, was a wandering Methodist who wandered around from parish to parish until he finally landed in New York City and began to preach in Washington Square, down by NYU, if you know Washington Square at all. And of course, at that time, New York was the great hub of immigration. And he began to gather strangers and immigrants, and soon he had a church, and soon he had an enormous church. A church of great influence, for he was also a great preacher, but he was one who welcomed people, and he was known as a welcoming person. The church was called the Church of the Strangers, and that's who it was for. A number of people of influence started to attend this church, from very wealthy people, among them the Vanderbilts. And when one of the Vanderbilts died, he preached a sermon which is included here. And here's what he said: "It's almost never appropriate to speak about a dead man at his funeral. No man would desire to allude to any of his human frailties and faults, and no man can make the dead man's friends love him any more than they do when they surround his remains. And so when the deceased charged that at his funeral not many words should be said, and that those words should be said deliberately, and that there should be no attempt to set forth any supposed virtue he might possess, the request was in accordance with my own feelings. I therefore come not to talk about the dead, but to the living." That was the philosophy of the 19th century preacher when it came to a funeral. We're in a very different age and era. There's a sense in which we can understand where they were coming from. We've heard people speak about preaching people into heaven, boasting about their good works, as if we're trying to persuade God in His mercy that He needs to take them, forgetting about Ephesians 2, "For it is by grace that you are saved, not by works, lest anyone should boast." And there are people in the church seeing that the funeral is becoming more and more personal in this nature, who are raising concerns about it, particularly from the Roman Catholic tradition. And it's really based on that there's only one name by which you can be saved. And it's a reminder and a call back to that. Now, as I said, in the obituaries, they're telling the stories. And I found a wonderful one in the Halifax paper. He liked reading and telling ghost stories around the campfire. He had a great love for his kids and taught them how to skate. He loved playing hockey with his children on the lake and watched their hockey games, and on this goes, telling the story of someone here in Nova Scotia who died. And there's the expectation that the funeral becomes the place, the story of the person is the center of the funeral. And so the eulogies, and all of you, I'm sure, have had people come, and there are going to be eulogies in the service, and sometimes they are numerous. And particularly as you move west across Canada and get into Western Canada, you'll find a phenomenon that the funeral directors refer to as the open mic funeral. And they'll have a mic like the one that was here down, and people can just get up in the funeral and say whatever they want. And you can imagine the kind of dangers with that, the kind of things that might be said. Oftentimes there are wonderful things said, so I don't mean to diminish it, but sometimes we find that people start insulting someone for the way they were caring for the deceased, or suggesting perhaps that they love the deceased more than someone else. All kinds of things, as I've heard stories from clergy across the country. There was, just 2 weeks ago, I noticed as I was reading through the obituaries in the Globe and Mail, and this is not unusual, it said, we'll be meeting at such and such a place where there will be spoken tributes, anecdotes, roasts, and toasts are welcome. This was for a funeral. We've gone, as you can see, in this relatively brief period of time, just over a century, we've gone from famine, really, to sort of potluck. And I'm not suggesting that we go back to famine at all, but I'm cautious about the potluck. There was an article in the Globe and Mail by Richard Valpy not long ago, and he was talking about this very phenomena, and he interviewed a professor at the Vancouver School of Theology, Richard Leggett, who told a horror story about doing a funeral, and somebody was giving a eulogy. The man had died from his alcoholism, and someone got up, a drinking buddy, and went on and on about all the good times they had drinking. I had a funeral where a daughter got up and started to say some wonderful things about her father, and somewhere in the midst of it, she said, of course, my father had a terrible temper. And there was this, and I don't think anyone remembered anything else from that service. And many of us had known the man for a long time, and we sat there racking our brains. Of course, and we're wondering, what's she getting at? But sometimes this kind of thing happens, and it can be very upsetting. Of course, when there are more and more eulogies, there's less and less time, and we'll get to that. There's a funeral home that I deal with in Toronto. I think it's one of the finest funeral homes in the city. And on their website, there's this. It's to clients or potential clients. By adding elements from the life being remembered, you are able to personalize a service and make it even more memorable and meaningful. Let our directors guide you in creating a distinctive and dignified celebration of a life. And on and on. And the whole idea is that it will become personal, and so they give all kinds of examples of how they've helped people do this. One of them is about Andrew, and they're all fairly similar, but Andrew, it said, loved golf. He was a hard-working man, but every Friday afternoon he would get out of the office during the summer and get over to the golf course. And so on Friday afternoon, we're going to be gathering with family and friends on the 18th green. We're going to share memories and swap stories. A piper piped. They had a recessional down the fairway. They had the flag on the 18th green at half-mast. This was the funeral. It was very, very personal. And the funeral home wasn't making fun of it. It was highlighting it as a wonderful example of how a funeral can be personal. But of course, as clergy, what does that mean? How do we fit into that? Now, that's just one thing that we noticed in the obituaries. Another thing is the whole movement towards cremation and what that means in terms of memorial, and then the word celebration. Cremation, again, it's something that is far more common in the West, where it's something like 75% of funerals, an enormous number. Don't quote me on that, but it's very high. And we can see why. There was an ad in today's Halifax paper on the obituary page where it's for a funeral home. I haven't seen this in a Toronto paper, and it named the prices that you could have a cremation, and I think it was for somewhere in the neighborhood of $1,200 or $1,500 complete, or a funeral, and I think it was between, depending on your casket, etc., between $3,000 and $5,000. So there's the economic reality of it, and of course in urban centers that's particularly true because it costs a lot more for the real estate for a casket than it does for an urn. So we have this reality that with the move to cremation, there's also a move towards memorial. And so with that, the service is following the cremation, and so the body is not present. A friend of mine, and I interviewed a number of clergy during my research, but a friend of mine from Vancouver Island, Mark Buchanan, some of you may know him, said this. He said, there's a gravity and a sense of seriousness when a body is there in the service, whereas I found a spirit of levity at memorials that can even become coarse when the person is not part of a faith community. And such coarseness is almost certainly absent if you have a funeral service and the body is present. There's a sobriety, a seriousness without having to say a word when the body is there. I don't know what you do. Sometimes usually when I come in, I'll put my hand on the casket. And many clergy will do something like that. And it's just an acknowledgement. And suddenly there is a somberness, and it's a positive, it's a reverence, it's a sacred time. And that can be lost, particularly when the memorial, and there are many reasons for this, when the memorial is stretched out a little bit, because once the body has been cremated, we have the ashes, there's no rush to have a service. And maybe someone who we'd like to give a eulogy is over in Europe traveling, we'll wait till they get back. Or maybe there's a family member who just can't get away from something, and so we'll have it in 2 weeks. And 2 weeks sometimes becomes 3 weeks, and sometimes it becomes even longer, months. And that somberness is lost. One of the clergy I interviewed told a very wonderful story about a parishioner who had come to them just before the service and said, now at what point in the service, his wife had died, at what point in the service do I give her the last kiss? And which struck him as, he never heard of such a thing, and neither had I. But it was just such a tenderness, such a sense that she's here and it's the last time. And so he, very pastorally and wonderfully, incorporated some way to acknowledge this for this person. But that doesn't happen when it's 6 weeks or 2 months later. That's very tender, vulnerable moment is lost. And it's a moment that when we have a funeral and the body is there, there is an openness that we don't know. And instead what we're finding, of course, is that not only is there a delay, but with the delay the mood changes. And so no longer is it marking the death or the passing. Instead it's celebrating the life. And so a family will say to me, they'll say, we've done well. We've gotten through it, and we're beyond it now. So it would be best if we didn't really even think about the death and the suffering, if we just celebrated the life. That's what we're here to do. That's what we want you to lead us in doing. And so gone is that tenderness and that opportunity to really touch something that's very sacred in the person, or so it would seem at least that it's gone. And this is reflected in the obituaries as well. Here's one that I read, January 5th in the Toronto Star. As per Al's wish, a memorial service celebration of life will be held in June. There was another one that same day for a 55-year-old husband, father, brother who had died in a car accident. And it said, a service will take place at a later date on April 19th at our property to celebrate his life. I read one in the Halifax paper for a 92-year-old woman. She had a church, she had a family. No visitation and burial, graveside service in Sable River Cemetery at a later date. And so what happens is, with the mood change, there's a desire to look upon the rite of passage as a celebration, as a positive event. Now that's the memorial, and you're going to point out to me that, come on, most of the services in the paper are still within a few days, and so there's still the tenderness. But there's a carryover effect. And so what happens is that someone will come to me and say, and the service is going to be 3 days after the death. They'll say, 2 weeks ago we were at say, Andrew's funeral. And it was out on the 18th green up at such and such a golf course. And, it was just wonderful. And there was no talk about death. It was all about celebration, and it was just so joyous. Do you think we can somehow incorporate some of that into the service? So I've had people come to me the day after a tragic, sudden death, and I'll talk more about this tomorrow, and say to me, we just want it to be a happy occasion. There's a move towards celebration, and it's not entirely healthy. It's not all bad, but it's not entirely healthy, because we have to guard against the loss of that tender moment, guard against participation in their denial. The third thing I notice in the obituaries is what I'll call the loss of home field advantage. We know in sports that if it's a hockey team, for example, now I won't use the Leafs because I don't know what difference the home field advantage makes, and I'm a fan, but in a hockey game, the home team gets the last change. In the baseball game, the home team gets the last at bat. Plus, they have their fans there, who are very, very helpful and cheering them on. As clergy, I think in many ways we've lost the home field advantage, and I'll tell you what I mean by that. That in the 19th century, in these sermons that were preached in that era, they were preached in the church. The funeral home, or parlor as it was called, was the place for the wake or the visitation if it wasn't being done in the home. It was sort of an extension of that. Now, of course, more and more funerals are being held in the funeral home. And part of that is because people don't have necessarily an affiliation with the church. Sometimes there are people who are deeply rooted in a church who don't want to have it in the church because then they find it very difficult to go back to the church after having had the service. So we need to be sensitive to that as pastors. But when we lose the home field advantage, you see, when a family comes in and sits down in my study and says to me, we're going to have 3 eulogies, and we're going to be this and that, I can say, just slow down. I want to honor, we both want to honor your loved one, but in the church, there are certain patterns that we like to follow, and it comes from our experience, and it's what we work with. And so we can talk about that later too, but there's wisdom, I think, in having some kind of home field rules about how many eulogies you have and how long they should be, and giving some kind of very practical guidelines, because many times people who get up to give a eulogy haven't spoken in public. And it's a good idea, not just to say you've got 4 minutes or something, but to say keep it all on one page double-spaced or something like that. Give them some kind of very practical guidelines. I'm not saying that we necessarily have to censor them, but keep them. And we can do that when it's in our church. But when it's in the funeral home, I read to you this piece from the funeral home. Let our directors guide you in creating a distinctive and dignified celebration of a life well lived. And this is not a criticism of funeral homes, but there's a sense in which we don't set the rules in a funeral home. We go, and the authority that you have is the authority of a pastor. And so if they're your people, they're going to listen to you and respect you. But if they're nominally related to your church or to you and your ministry in some way, you may not have that kind of authority. And so you may get there, and I find this increasingly true as the years go by compared to the early times. You may get there and find that the service is pretty well already planned before you begin your conversation, at least in their mind. They may have already invited people to speak. And so we've lost an edge in terms of the home field advantage. And what happens is the same thing with the celebration and the memorial. There's a carryover effect to the church. And so there's a sense in which people have taken ownership of this notion that they can customize their funeral. And they can plan it. And so they come with it planned, even for a church service. There's just this sense that that's part of it now. Personalization, celebration, customization. That's kind of the name of the game. Now, with the loss of the home field advantage and with eulogists, and sometimes, particularly when it's not in the church, you can't control them. There is the matter of the clock and how much time all of this is going to take, and the expectation that many have. The service is not to go beyond an hour or an hour and 15 or whatever it is, but they've already planned all of these other things. They've got music and this and that, and suddenly you're wondering, how much time am I going to have to speak? I think it's very important when we're meeting with families, right from the outset, in a sensitive and compassionate way, to make it clear to them that this is what I do, this is who I am, this is what I do, and we offer prayers, and we offer scriptures, and I offer a word, a homily, and a time when I speak, so that they know that that's part of it as well. And then in conversation, you can speak about the other things. But it's very important to be sensitive to the clock. But there's a sense in which we've lost the clock. It's not on our side. It's been taken from us with the home field advantage. I had a service, and this was someone from my congregation in a funeral home in Toronto, and I met with the widow, a family I've known because I had known them even in Montreal. So I think I had known them for 15 years at this point. And so her husband had died, wonderful family. And they were going to gather in the funeral home. It was going to be in the parlor of the funeral home, the receiving room, the next night. And she said, now, we're just going to keep it brief. We're going to be serving food, and there's going to be refreshments for people, and there'll be a lot of mingling. And then, people are coming at about 7. And so we think at about 7:45, maybe you could just address everyone. We're not going to have any seats. There'll be a few chairs for some of the more senior folk to sit in. But if you could just address everyone and just sum it all up, maybe, and then people who need to go can go. It was like conducting a funeral in a cocktail hour. I mean, it's something that these 19th century preachers would not have any sense of. And yet that's the kind of thing that we're facing. That's an extreme example, but that's the kind of thing. Suddenly the whole thing has to be done in 10 minutes because everyone's standing up. And what are you going to say? What are you going to do in 10 minutes? And it's not even your space. The fifth thing I want to talk about, which also is reflected in the obituaries. I noticed a piece, it's jumped off the page at me, in one of the Toronto papers just a few weeks ago, an obituary in which, in italics, there was a quotation from Psalm 139. It was beautiful. But it jumped off the page at me because we don't see that very often in our papers, and yet there was a time when it was not all that unusual for some special verse to be mentioned. But it symbolizes the fact that in many ways, it's not just the home field advantage and the clock that have been taken from us, but the playbook, if you will, the scriptures. We know all about biblical illiteracy. We face it in our own congregations. But it's compounded when we have the congregation that gathers for a funeral, because so many of those people, at least in my experience, are not from the church or from a church. They're people who are, quote-unquote, unchurched. I'm not crazy about that word because I'm not even sure if it is a word, but I'll use it anyways. So in the 19th century, when we look through these sermons, we find that every sermon began with a quotation of Scripture. Some of the sermons were exegetical sermons. They would go on for, when I talk about losing the clock, these sermons would go on for an hour and a half to 2 hours, some of them. Deems, Church of the Strangers, he said, I'm only going to preach a request for just a few words. That was a short sermon. It was 40 minutes long. And they were just peppered full of quotations from Scripture without quoting the verse. So there was an assumption that people knew where these were coming from, or characters of the Bible, without telling the whole story, just making a brief reference to them, as if everyone knew, and people did know the Bible quite well in the 19th century. But today, I've discovered that we're down to a few texts. I've asked a number of clergy, what text do you use? Psalm 23, Romans 8, John 14, wonderful texts. It's interesting that in the 19th century, those texts were rarely used. There were all kinds of other texts that we wouldn't even imagine using. But the reason that we use these texts, particularly John 14 and Psalm 23, is because they're almost the last texts that still somehow have some kind of a hold on an unchurched population. There's some kind of recognition factor with the Lord as my shepherd, or I go to prepare a place for you. There's just something about those that still speaks in our time and our age. But those are we're just down to a few texts. I was called by the school where, as Andrew mentioned, I studied my basic degree, Wycliffe College. They've asked me if I'd come and do a lecture for their clergy, a continuing education course, because the clergy are frustrated. They're not sure what to preach on at funerals because they've been using the same texts over and over. And I wasn't surprised. There's just a small handful of texts. And if you start to say the Lord's Prayer at a funeral, this is really the test. Or you ask the people to recite the 23rd Psalm with you, and suddenly halfway through you realize that there's just a few other people with you in the Lord's Prayer, the 23rd Psalm. You understand what I'm getting at. It's as if the good book, and we are ministers of the Word, the good book has been taken from us. On Sundays we get up and we proclaim the Word. We preach at exegetical sermons. We spend hours in the book preparing. But at a funeral, it's not only biblical illiteracy that we're facing. It's a sense of biblical irrelevancy that we're facing in this age, where the book just doesn't have a hold on anyone. It doesn't seem to matter. It's no different than any other book. And so you'll meet with a family, and they'll bring all kinds of other texts from all kinds of different schools of thought and suggest that we maybe have a reading from this or from that. There was a book that came out in the fall. It was briefly, I don't think it is now, but it was on the New York Times bestseller list. There was a great deal of press about it. J.J. Jacobs, a secular Jew in New York City, has written a book, A Year of Living Biblically. And I don't know if you've seen the book. It's actually worth reading. There's some very good moments in that book. But I think when he started, and this is what has left the impression on many people, is that the Bible is just a joke. Because he goes and he grows his hair on the side long, and he watches people sort of looking at him funny in the street. And he's quite concerned about wool and linen being mixed, and so he's paying all this money to make sure they're not mixed. And he's taking the letter of the Levitical code to a precision, and then almost saying, isn't this book ridiculous? But there are moments in the book that are quite rich. And that's why there are some things that are actually worth pointing out in the book. But the fact is, when the public sees that, there's just this sense that the Bible's an outdated book. It doesn't really belong. The great Shakespearean actor Ian McKellen, who plays Gandalf, I think, on Lord of the Rings, he was quoted not too long ago. I think it was on Good Morning America, and he said the Bible should come with a disclaimer. This book is not true. This book is fiction. So there's a sense not only that people don't know it, but that it doesn't really matter, that it's not the authority that it once is. And so we go into a funeral, and it's as if the ground has been taken from beneath us. It's not the same world, though it wasn't long ago that the 19th century clergy preached in. I went to a funeral. I've been to about 3 since Christmas because of members of the congregation whose family members have died. And one was, I won't say what denomination, it doesn't matter. But in one, they didn't read from the Bible. It was in a church. They didn't read from the Bible. And the name of Jesus wasn't mentioned. And then I went to another one. It was in a church. There was a liturgical sense, and so there were prayers, there were scriptures. But again, in the homily, the name of Jesus wasn't mentioned. In both cases, there was sort of there were references to God as a comforting presence. But it's not just the book, it's Jesus. Now, I don't understand that, because even in a world where there's biblical illiteracy and irrelevancy, I'm not sure at all that the world has said Jesus is irrelevant. Richard Dawkins, The God Delusion, said in a CBC interview just before Christmas, He said, despite the fact he doesn't believe in God and all of this, he thinks the churches should go. He's all for getting rid of religion. Nonetheless, he says, I'm fascinated with Jesus. And his friends say they want to buy him a shirt that says Atheists for Jesus. I say the church should pray for Richard Dawkins. I don't think he's any further away from the kingdom than Saul of Tarsus was. And when someone phoned him, I mentioned this at Wolfville Baptist yesterday, someone phoned him on a talk show on the BBC and said, what would you say to someone who told you that they've had a religious experience of God? And there was this blank. He said, I wouldn't know what to say because I've never had anything like that. You know, the church should be praying for the world around that we're living in. But in the meantime, as we're preparing to minister to the bereaved, we're facing all of this. And then this. By the way, I said to a friend of mine who's a member of a denomination in which one of those funerals was where they didn't read from the Bible, didn't mention Jesus. I said, what's going on? He said, we're just afraid of offending anyone. And, well, the last thing is this. Before we've also lost, I'll stay with the hockey analogy or whatever. We've lost our C. We used to be the captain. When I read these sermons, there's a sermon in here that was preached by Tyrone Edwards. It was a great preacher in Rochester. It was preached at the funeral of the first President Harrison, who died in the 19th century. He said, I stop not to dwell upon his character or to estimate his merits, standing on higher ground as God's ambassador. I turn to his removal as a national event in which the Lord is speaking to us as a people. This great sense of authority in the 19th century pulpit. They could speak to the nation. They could say, God is saying something to us through all of this. And there's this, what's he saying? The sense of listening. But we're afraid to mention the name of Jesus. We're afraid to read from the book because it's irrelevant. We've lost our C, our captaincy. And now you may not notice this as much in Nova Scotia because I see that in the obituaries, still very often it says the service will be conducted by the Reverend so-and-so, so-and-so. About 30% of your notices still say that. None of our notices in Toronto say that. And I know Toronto's a bad city, so it's not a good example. But it's not just Toronto. I mean, I think Nova Scotia is just a very special place, that's all. It's not just Toronto. There was a film not too long ago that came out called Elizabethtown. And I don't know if any of you saw it. My daughter had me see it. It had Orlando Bloom in it. And Spider-Man's girlfriend, what's her name? Kirsten Dunst, I think. So, it's a popular film. Orlando Bloom plays this young guy, I think he's from Oregon maybe, or California, the West Coast. Modern. Contemporary. And his father has died. He gets word that his father's died in Kentucky. And so he goes back to Kentucky to take care of his father's funeral. Now, everyone in Kentucky has it all planned. This is going to be a traditional funeral. But Orlando Bloom, he's a West Coaster. This isn't going to be traditional. I'm going to cremate him. I'm going to go on a road trip when I'm done. I'm going to sprinkle his ashes here and there and all these special places. But everyone in that community, people who have been in touch with his father all of his life, say that's not the way you do it here. We have a funeral. We do this and we do that. So at any rate, my daughter said to me, she said, what did you think of the film? And I said, it was interesting. It was all about tradition and modern. It was, about the clashes and what you do. In the end, this is it. What they did in that film was they had just to compromise, they had a funeral with a casket, but not a body. They put all the things that mattered to them and spoke to them personally about the person in the casket. They went to the grave, buried it. Meanwhile, the son had his wish, which was a cremation, and off he went and sprinkled the ashes. So it was a sort of a crazy compromise. I said to my daughter, she said, what did you think? I said, well, it's okay. I said, she said, what did you think of Orlando Bloom? What did you think of, I said, what did you think of the person who played the minister? She said, I don't remember the minister. Well, which one was the minister? I said, there wasn't a minister. Here was a war about how to do a funeral, modern or traditional. And the one person who's missing is the minister. Now, there was a rather kind of coarse film that came out in the fall. What was it called? Death at a Funeral, I think. It was a British film. I don't know if anybody saw it. It was actually very clever, very funny, but a little bit coarse. And they did have a minister. The funeral wasn't taking place in the church. All the things that I've mentioned were happening there. The minister was just a joke. That's all you can say. He kept looking at his watch saying, come on, when can we get going? When can we get going? I got to get... And all these things were happening. All these things were falling apart. And he was always anxious to get out of there. He just had no sort of presence. And certainly he wasn't the captain who was there to set things straight and steer the ship. And sometimes that's desperately what's needed. But we've lost the sea, and I want to tell you how serious it is. There's a former Southern Baptist minister by the name of Doug Manning. If you're in the funeral business, you know who he is. He's a guru in the funeral world. Just ask your funeral director. You heard of Doug Manning? He works for the Dodge Funeral Company, one of the biggest funeral companies. He was a Southern Baptist minister. But he's become a guru on sort of bereavement issues. He's written about 60 books on dealing with grief and death, and they hire him. He's sort of a spokesman for the industry, and he goes around speaking at conferences, motivational speaker. He's very good, actually. But he says awful things about the clergy. You just have to read the Dodge magazine every once in a while. And there's these articles by Doug Manning. He says things like, the clergy, the modern clergy, have done a great deal of harm to the funeral. And he goes on at great length about how clergy are trying to convert everyone at the funeral. How they get up to give a eulogy, and it's the same one every time, and they always get the name of the deceased wrong. And just horror stories, one after another. I phoned up Doug Manning. I got his number. You can trace these people down. I said, Doug Manning, I said, I've been reading your stuff. I'm doing some research on funerals, on clergy at funerals. I said, I read here that you say, this. I said, well, do you got some research? It would be really helpful if you had some research that I could, sort of back this up, because it's pretty, well, so-and-so told, and he's just a magnet for every bad story. And he's got an ego, so that he doesn't have any interest in hearing about another minister who does a good job. But what he has is incredible influence in the industry. And so when he says the clergy are doing a bad job and people read it, this is more authoritative than the Bible. And so he's come to Toronto and he's set up a course at Humber College, and he's done the same thing in Chicago and a number of other centers for, guess what? Funeral celebrants. Secular funeral celebrants, because we need to take the funeral away from the clergy. And so they're training people at Humber College. They've trained over 1,000 people. He's sort of the dean of the whole thing. To take the funeral away from the clergy, because the clergy have ruined it. I've read a piece in the Chicago paper, in the Toronto Star. There was a piece last summer. Peter Skilleter was interviewed. He's become one of these secular celebrants. He goes on at length about clergy who have these rote services where they never have anything humorous. I've got humor in my service. Well, there's a place for humor. But humor can be just another form of denial, too. It can be a running away. I don't know. That's not the solution. But he goes on and on about this thing, how we're better than the clergy. Front page of the Toronto Star. Front page of the Chicago Tribune. Same kind of thing. They've taken the C away, and they've said, I don't think this thing belongs to the clergy anymore. It's not just that our names are being taken out of the obituary. We're really being taken out of the picture if we're not careful. I think Manning's wrong. I'm not going to lose any more sleep over him than I lose over Richard Dawkins. But I think we need to know how to respond to all this stuff. I think it's very important that we know how to respond. And I think my word to you is the same word that Jesus gave the apostles on Easter Day. And that's our great hope. Fear not. Fear not. Don't be afraid. Don't let it be said of you, we're afraid to offend anyone. Not that we're out to offend anyone, but don't be afraid. Don't be operating from a position of fear. And the key to that is not just, okay, we've talked about what's going on, knowing what's going on, but knowing who you are in the midst of what's going on. That is crucial. Knowing who you are, who I am in the midst of it. It's very important to know and to remember again and again that we are mortal. That every time we come face to face with the death, to let it touch us, not to put an armor to protect ourselves, not to hide behind anything. Last year I started a Lenten series in my congregation. And it was called Pilgrimage of Sacred Spaces. And we're doing it again this year. We started last Wednesday. Every Wednesday evening in Lent, we go to a different church. And this year we have some of the sister churches on the hill, Andrew's Church and some others, joining with us. And last week we started at the Roman Catholic Cathedral in Toronto, St. Michael's. And a dear friend of mine, Father Damien McPherson, conducted the service. And it was Ash Wednesday. And so Damien talked about what Ash Wednesday means and about the ceremony of ashes. And that's foreign to most of us Baptists. And then he invited us to come forward to receive the ashes. And he puts them on your face, on your forehead, makes the sign of the cross. From dust you have come, to dust you shall return. And it was very moving. I went home. We had our evening. I went home, got home with some things, finished watching the hockey game. Anyways, it was finished before it was finished. But at any rate, I'm just kidding. But I get up. I don't know if I was brushing my teeth or what, but I look in the mirror and there it is. There's the ashes, and it strikes me, and I could hear the words again. From dust you have come, to dust you shall return. To remember that, to let that touch us every time. We are mortal, not to run from that. And as we do, as we're able to be touched, we, I think, can become a healing people. We can become sensitive to the wounds in the community and know that every story matters. And so we're not afraid of the personalization of the funeral. We do need to lay some rules for the groundwork for that. But we must not be afraid. I don't think Jesus would be afraid of that. They didn't do it in the 19th century. They're still not doing it in some traditions. But we don't need to be afraid of the personalization of the funeral. Every life is precious. What we need to keep in mind is not simply that we're human and mortal, but also of what our calling is. We're called to be ministers of the Word. This is another thing the Baptists struggle with, but it's more us than anyone else, and don't forget that. We are called to a priesthood. We are called to a priesthood, and when we are engaged in responding to the grief of a family, we're being engaged as priests. Don't be afraid of that word. We believe in the priesthood of all believers. That includes the clergy. And what that means is that this is a sacred event. And like a priest, we are coming to make an offering. We are offering this person up to God in thanksgiving for their life. And so we're not afraid of the story because the story is sacred. But it's told in the context of the offering, and it's told as an offering of thanksgiving. And so that needs to be made clear to the people, that when we remember a life, when we're paying tribute to it, it's an act of thanksgiving. And that we as clergy are there to lead the people in a priestly sense. And of course, as ministers of the Word, and this is the other side of the priestly sense, that we are there to give the people the sense not only of God's Word and what He's saying, but also of His presence. We need not shy away from the personalization of the funeral. Jesus, when He moved in this world, saw each one in their own unique setting. And above all, we are ambassadors of Christ. We must not ever shy away from the Word or from His name. That's who we are called to be. Ambassadors of Christ. It doesn't mean that we're trying to convert people or banging them over the head. But when I come to a funeral, that's who I am. That's what my calling is. And I mustn't lose sight of it. I'm a compassionate, seek to be anyways, compassionate, sensitive pastor. But in the midst of that, in a caring, tender way. Seek to offer to them the good word of God. The word of God's love and His mercy, of His care for us. We'll get into a little more about that in the next few days. But that's what we're doing. Knowing who we are. We're human beings. We have our own mortality, but we have our calling. Our calling as ambassadors of Christ. And so that's what I'll end it with this. You know, when my congregant tells me that he gets up and reads the paper and doesn't see his name, he knows he can get up and get on the go. We get up, we read the obituary, and it all looks like bad news. The ground is shifted. Our name isn't there, probably. They've taken away the book. They've taken away the time clock. They've taken away the home field advantage. Everything seems to have shifted. But don't be afraid. Get up. Because there's good news to be proclaimed. We have the best news in all the world in the face of death. We serve a risen Christ. And this is who we're called to proclaim. Proclaim that word in season and out. So don't go back to bed with all this bad news. Get up and get to work. And fear not. Amen.
Your message tonight. It was very, very helpful for me. I'm young in the pastorate. I've only been just ordained this last September, but I've done 17 funerals because I'm in a rural area of older people, so I'm often called upon, and I'm the only church in the community as well. One of the very first funerals that I was called upon to do was the patriarch of the community in the church. And he spent his last couple of months ministering to me. I think it was Tom Harper wrote the book on the atheism or about Christ. He gave me that book to try to change me in my views about Christ. And he did this for the last 3 months before he died. And this is the patriarch of the church. When he did pass away, his wife had called me in to his home and had said to me that I want you to preach his funeral. You are the only pastor here, but I don't want you to mention the name Jesus Christ once during the funeral. I was bewildered. And like you said about the pastors being owned by the community, I didn't know what to do, so I turned to more senior people for advice, and one of the advices was, you have to minister in this situation, so don't mention the name of Jesus Christ, and just preach an Old Testament passage on God's care. But I never felt right about it, even though I did it that way, and the funeral had 500 people at it. So not to have the opportunity to mention the name of Jesus Christ to 500 people, the best opportunity you could ever have to do it, was very disheartening for me. And I'll be looking forward to probably your next few lectures if there's a way that we can how we pastors can get back that authority without having the dilemma of doing it in a grief situation.
Thank you for sharing your story. That's I'm not here to stand in judgment over anyone. I've never had anyone say to me, "Don't mention the name of Jesus." I have had that at weddings, but weddings are entirely different. There's 1,000 ways to respond, but maybe over the next few days we'll find something that is. I hope we'll find something that's helpful. And thank you for sharing your story.
Peter, I worked as a chaplain for 8 years in hospitals, and you're talking specifically about funerals, but being a pastoral care person yourself previously, my observation in hospital was the way even staff began to move away from people who were dying. And long before the funeral or the person had even expired. So something is happening in our society that we're moving further and further away from death long before the death has occurred. I dealt with a 22-year-old woman when I first met her who had been diagnosed with cancer, and watched her over the 2 years that I was caring for her, and just noticed that amongst the staff, doctors, and I guess I'd just like to know, you're talking specifically about funerals and that, but it happens long before that. So what is your response to us as clergy, as people visiting in hospitals, and in our experience at that level?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I wouldn't presume to know why someone would move away. I mean, there is an incredible fear of death, and there is a movement away from death for certain. There may also be, I mean, I have been in a few situations that had the privilege of being with someone when they died. It's a very sacred experience, one that you almost can't talk about, especially when it's a long life that's been lived well, and there's just a sense of peace. It may be, and I don't know the situation, it may be sometimes people move away from it, respecting the fact that the family or the immediate caregivers who are there, it's their time, and it's their time to be alone and sacred, and they don't want to impose upon that. I mean, I do know that because I've had people, in hospices, and I know that the staff that I've come across in hospices have a wonderful sensitivity about death and about the moment of death. And sometimes I think they may back away out of respect for the families and that sacredness of that situation. But the worst thing in the world, on the contrary, the worst thing in the world is for someone in such a situation to die alone. And people have a great fear of dying alone. And that's something in pastoral care you hear over and over in different ways, that people, it'll come out in some strange way, that people just don't want to be alone at that moment. And so if we, whatever our position is, if we move away from them and leave them alone, it's not healthy. It's not fair. It's not good. Thank you.
Somebody else with a question? Okay.
I guess the questions are all coming from this corner, but I'll go ahead.
Dr. Holmes, just with regards to, I hadn't heard somehow I missed the news, the secular celebrants movement, but also I had quite a while ago commented, and I don't know when this happened, and maybe you, from your doctoral work or what have you, had done a little research on this, I'm not sure, but it was just in terms of even the pronouncement of the dust to dust, and the adoption by the funeral directors of the doing, sometimes with sanitized white sand, of putting it on the casket or what have you. And my practice or my experience from years ago in Newfoundland, when we had a lot of home wakes, and there always was a funeral in the church and a burial in the local graveyard or whatever, but it was always the minister who did that, or the minister in conjunction with one of the family members, and it was taken over by the funeral directors, I don't know when. And it seems to me to be somewhat symbolic about this issue of the minister's role and the funeral director's role. So I just wondered if you might want to comment on that.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I hadn't thought about the white sand. I mean, the ashes they use, the charcoal they use in the Ash Wednesday is very dirty. And you're right, the sand they use is pretty clean, and it's kind of... That's an interesting point. I hadn't thought of that. My experience is that usually the funeral director will say, would you like to do the sand? Do other people have that experience? And then I'll say, if you don't mind doing it, because sometimes we're standing there at the grave and it's very windy and there's all these other things going on. It's easier just to let the other person do this. But if you do it, if you're athletic enough or coordinated enough that you can balance all these things and make the cross, I think that's great, and you should do it. I think it's very good if you can do it. But my experience has been that I've always been asked, and I appreciate being asked. And if they're not asking you and you'd like to do it, I would suggest that you just tell them that you prefer to do it yourself. That's what I wouldn't surrender. Now, the secular funeral celebrants, it's a very new movement. It's maybe, I'm guessing, maybe 5 years old. It's not entirely bad, because I'll tell you what the alternative is, and this is more pronounced on the West Coast, that Elizabethtown, Oregon, California thing. The more common thing is that there's nothing at all. It's not unusual that someone dies. I grew up on Vancouver Island, in Vancouver or Vancouver Island, and there's nothing. Absolutely nothing. They just call it a disposal. That's all. So I think that actually, for people's own well-being, that it's better to have a secular celebrant doing something, because people need a chance to say goodbye. They need a chance to acknowledge the life. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't have them or anything like that, but I'm just wanting us to all be aware that it's happening, that there's this move against us. And
Dr. Wooden?
You've talked about the problems as the obituaries display it, with the change from older styles of understanding what a funeral is to the present move away from wanting anything to do with death. How does one train a congregation in what is appropriate for a Christian funeral, so that we don't have Christians wanting secular funerals?
That's a great question. In fact, Tom Long, who's been working on a book, the preacher from, he's coming to my church this summer. I better figure out where he's from. But he's now down in Georgia, right? Where is he, Andrew? Emory, yeah, he's at Emory, yeah. He's just coming out with a book. He's been working on it for about 10 or 12 years. And this is really the focus of his book. It's really preparing a congregation. That's a big part of it, at least, preparing a congregation. And so, but there are different ways. One, we could put together any policies that you have should be accessible to members of the congregation. So there's not a secret that's hiding away that you bring out to club people over the head with when they try to break the rules. It's better if they know the rules ahead of time. And it's the same for funerals or for weddings. And it's important to have some guidelines. And it's a good idea to have them pass through your deacons. That's if you're a Baptist. And I recognize there are many traditions here. But in the congregational setting, I would say it's a good idea to have guidelines, and it's a good idea to have the leaders of your congregation behind them, so that it's not just you and then someone's going to come along and hang you out to dry. Because, sometimes you're going to have to take a stand. But to make these things known in the congregation, so that people know, it's probably not a bad idea, although I haven't done this, but now that you mention it, maybe I should, every once in a while to have some kind of a seminar, maybe about preparing people for death. Now, there are churches that I know of which have not only a guideline, but they also have a sheet that you can fill out with any ideas you have about your own funeral. And that's actually very, very helpful to families. When the person has made some of these things known in the church. I know a church in Toronto has a file of these, and it's a good idea. I haven't gotten around to do it. I don't know if you do that, Andrew, or not, or if any of you do that, but it's a very good idea. They'll pick down their 2 or 3 favorite hymns. That's a huge help to the family. And it means that we're not singing the same hymns at every funeral, because the family will say, what hymns do you think? And put down a few of their favorite scriptures, which then gets us away from this thing where we've only got 2 or 3 scriptures to go on, which we don't, by the way, but which we seem to have fallen into. So that can be very helpful. Getting people to pre-plan with the church. All kinds of people pre-plan with the funeral home, but to pre-plan with the church. Thank you for the question.
We can take another if you have another question you want to raise before we finish.
Probably this question is the one that probably brought me here. Is it possible for a minister of the gospel to see so much stuff anti-Christian, wanting it to be at a funeral, that he would absolutely refuse to do it. And when I asked the question, I have in mind one where I wasn't conducting the funeral, but I was present. And I was waiting for the line to make its way up to meet the family. On the big TV screen, which now is very familiar in all the funeral homes, flipping through the slides of the character that had passed away in good things, bad things, there was a picture of the deceased and two sisters mooning the audience. And that was going on just prior to the actual funeral itself. So I'm asking, and other things have been asked as well, songs which you wouldn't ever want sung. So my question is, would a minister ever refuse to conduct a funeral given those kind of circumstances?
That's a great question. Everyone has to weigh that in their own conscience. Because, I mean, on the one hand, we're called as pastors to be among those who are suffering and grieving, and in the midst of that, there's often some kind of inappropriate expression of it. I mean, that's an extreme case, and that's got to be very upsetting. But you have to know this, too, that when that happens, that's not only upsetting to you as a minister of the gospel, that's upsetting to a lot of people. And that when you're there, I'll tell you, I was offered, this isn't a funeral, it's a wedding. And I was asked to do this wedding it was taking place at Victoria College at the University of Toronto. It was an outdoor wedding, a wonderful couple, an older couple. It was a late thing, so they both had children of their own. And it was a very sort of modern sort of service, and they had me there and a Catholic priest and all kinds of other people. And we did our things at various times. It wasn't organized like a wedding service that I've ever done before. Somebody got up and read a poem that was obscene. It was a family member. It was a son-in-law, I think, of the groom. And I looked around as this was going on, and I could see in the eyes of the people, not all of them, but enough of them, a disgust. At that moment that I knew, because I was next, I knew that my role was to reestablish dignity for that moment, somehow to reclaim the dignity and the sacredness of the space. And your presence as a clergy person in the midst may be the last hope for that. If they've taken the body away, if there's just nothing sort of reclaiming the solemnity of the moment, your presence may make a difference. And there are people there dying for someone to bring some kind of solemnity or some kind of reverence or to restore the sacredness. And some of that behavior, we have to understand it too. Some of it, rather than even judging it or cursing it, I think we have to understand that some of that inappropriate behavior sometimes comes from people who don't know what to do with death because we're running away from it. And so this silly stuff comes out. And I've had people say silly things in eulogies, upsetting things. And so our role is to bring that sense of the sacred back.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you, Norman, for your question. Well, we're going to wind it up there, and in a few moments you'll be welcome to join in the refreshment period. But this has been a phenomenal start, and I'm going to ask you as we say thank you to Dr. Holmes, simply to express your appreciation of tonight's lecture. And I have a feeling that the weather's going to have to be pretty bad to keep you away tomorrow night. Let's say thank you. Thanks, Peter.